Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Bowman. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Dean of the WVU College of Law, and we welcome you all here for this exciting event tonight. We are here to celebrate the launch of a new book being published by the WVU Press, Appalachian Reckoning, a region responds to Hillbilly Elegy. So it's been 3 years, it seems like just yesterday, but it's been 3 years since J.D. Vance won a lot of attention and praise for his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, about growing up poor in Ohio and Kentucky, and the book was a hit, was constantly talked about, and is the American way. It is now being made into a movie. This book, Appalachian Reckoning, is a response, a retort, if you will, to Hillbilly Elegy, and it moves beyond it in a meaningful and important way by allowing Appalachians from varied backgrounds to tell their own diverse and complex stories through a blend of scholarship and prose and poetry and photography. It shows the depth and the complexity of life in modern Appalachia, and it's something that's very important to us and something that means a lot to me as someone who is, I'm myself a child of Appalachia, and I think this kind of work is very, very important. So we have with us tonight the editors of Appalachian Reckoning, Anthony Harkins and Meredith Carroll. And we also have contributors Crystal Good and Roger May, and my WVU colleague Audra Slocum, an assistant professor of English education, will moderate the panel. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to tonight's event. I also should say, before I give up the podium, I'm sorry, stay here, that this event is being co-sponsored by the WVU Press, the Appalachian Justice Initiative here at the law school, which is a wonderful confederation of faculty and staff and students to focus on Appalachian issues, and the WVU Humanities Center. Audrey, you have the podium.
All right, welcome, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. We have some really wonderful folks up here. The basic rundown of tonight's events will include the 4 speakers, each speaking for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some prepared questions that the panelists will respond to, and then we'll open it up for your questions. At this time, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So we have 2 editors of the collection, Meredith Carroll and Tony Harkins. Tony Harkins is a professor of history at Western Kentucky University. He is the author of Hillbilly, A Cultural History of an American Icon, and Colonels, Hillbillies, and Fightin', 20th Century Kentucky in the National Imagination, from the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. He's also the co-editor, along with Douglas Powell and Catherine Ledford, of the media section of the Encyclopedia of Appalachia. Meredith McCarroll is a director of writing and rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine. She earned her PhD in English at the University of Tennessee, and her essays have been published in The Bitter Southerner, Avidly, Southern Cultures, and The Guardian. Her scholarship on regional identity, racial construction, voice, and literature has been published in the Appalachian Journal, Pluck, and Praxis. She is the author of Unwhite, Appalachia, Race, and Film. Her work is situated at the intersection of race and regional studies with a focus on cinematic representation at this intersection. The 2 contributors in the collection tonight who will be speaking are Crystal Good and Roger May. Crystal Good is an advocate, an entrepreneur, a writer-poet who uses poetry and performance and to explore the landscape of West Virginia and Appalachia. Yes. And it lends into the multiverse. She is a member of the Appalachian Poets and an Irene McKinney Scholar, and performs with Heroes Are Gang Leaders, a New York-based free avant-garde experimental improvisation jazz ensemble. She is the author of Valley Girl, and she is the CEO of Mixed Media and Good Hemp, an Appalachian small farm natural cosmetics company. Roger May is an Appalachian American photographer based in his home state of West Virginia. His photographs, essays, and interviews have been published in The Guardian, The New York Times, National Geographic, The Atlantic, and many other publications. In 2014, he started the crowdsourced project Looking at Appalachia. In addition to photographing, also a word, Appalachia, he writes about place, identity, and visual representation. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are going to begin with Tony, and we'll move down from there. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And I have to say, Meredith and I, is that good? Meredith and I are just kind of blown away by this turnout. It's very, very exciting. It shows that this book obviously needed to be written, and so I'm glad we were involved in doing that. It's become a book which is really transformed in many ways over its short lifespan, and I think it's become a much bigger project. The whole is much greater than the parts, because it initially started as simply a response to Hillbilly Elegy, which came out of a panel that I proposed for the Appalachian Studies Association. And the turnout there was quite enormous as well. And the press came to me and said, would you like to put this together for a book? And I said, okay. So I was working on that, and then they came to me and said, so we have this other project as well of voices of Appalachia from all different places and experiences, and it would be great if we blended these two things together. And so that's what we've done, and I think it's been an incredible journey so far, and I think it's really added to the whole experience, plus adding the photography and poetry in the best tradition of Appalachian studies, mixing all the disciplines and approaches together. I think it's created a much richer text. So I thought I'd just read I'll just read the introduction, the first paragraph, because I think it kind of captures the whole thing, maybe gives you a sense of what the book is about. From Why This Book? And this is a book born out of frustration. This is a book born out of hope. It attempts to speak for no one and to give voice to many. This is a book that could have emerged without Hillbilly Elegy, but it was also created in the explicit context of a post-election, post-Hillbilly Elegy moment. It therefore attempts to respond to those who have felt that they understand Appalachia now that they have read Hillbilly Elegy, and to push back against and complicate those understandings. It is meant to open a conversation about why the book struck such a deep nerve with many in the region, but it is not meant to demonize J.D. Vance, although some of you may wish to. Instead, the contributors to this book prioritize focusing on the region, reclaiming some of the talk about Appalachia, and offering ideas through the voices of many who have deep, if varied, lived experiences in and of Appalachia. And so I think one thing that we've worked on as we've worked together is the idea that there is no one Appalachia, of course. There are many Appalachian experiences, and we wanted to give voice to as many of those as we could, and to recognize the pain and the suffering and the hardship, but also the joy and the pleasure and the innovation of the region. And to do that through the voices of the region, both scholarly, creative, and even whimsical at times. So I'm hoping that's what the book will provide for its audience. And I think there's a little in here for everyone. So thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? A little more? All right. Closer. Okay. How's that? Okay, great. As Tony mentioned, this book began well, we came at this project from two different places, not actually knowing that our paths would intersect, but we're very glad that they did. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the essay of mine that's in this collection. That was my starting point and the way that I was kind of brought into this. I was also contacted by the press and asked to expand this into sort of a memoir, and I thought, I'm glad to tell this story, but I don't need to tell more of this story. Lots of other people have stories to tell, so that's kind of why we collected these stories. But here's a little bit from on and on, Appalachian accent and academic power. Let's go around the room and say where we're from. It was my first day in a class called Experiencing Appalachia during my first year of college. Raleigh, someone said. Just outside of Charlotte, said another. High Point. The professor continually nodded as the circle made its way to me. Haywood County, I said, her eyebrows raised in respect. My home was only about 100 winding miles from the classroom in which I was sitting, but Haywood County suddenly became more than a place to me. It was a marker of identity. I knew that I was a mountain girl. My family had been in Haywood County for generations, and one branch of my family tree started, or stopped, depending on your perspective, when the Cherokee were marched through. But I had to take a class called Experiencing Appalachia to even know that I was Appalachian. To experience the region, we studied the Foxfire magazines like those that lined the bookshelves in my childhood living room. We practiced churning butter. We read about quilting. Some of this resonated with me because it was familiar. My granny painstakingly taught me to quilt one summer, which mostly meant that I spent time watching her pull out all of my sloppy handwork. My granny and pa, who lived next door, grew and canned tomatoes and green beans. I knew the differences between half runners and blue lakes, and I know of no sound more satisfying than the pop of lids sealing on the kitchen counter in the late afternoon. But there were plenty of Appalachian traditions that I did not know, and there was nothing markedly Appalachian that we did because we had to. It is true that I had eaten groundhog on a camping trip and could name most of the local peaks by sight, but it's also true that I bought incense and spirulina at the health food store in Asheville. I ate more tempeh than I did fatback, and I loved Ani DeFranco and Doc Watson equally. So then I talk a little bit about moving away and going to Boston and realizing that people thought things about me because of the way I talked and because of where I was from. So yet, while I was proud of my home, I was also learning that powerful stereotypes about Appalachia had arrived in places like Boston well before me and had influenced the way that even the most considerate people thought about me. The banjo lick from Deliverance backed many introductory conversations when I said where I was from. But instead of calling people out for their ignorance, I distanced myself from Haywood County. I laughed along. I waited longer and longer before saying where I was from. I blended in. One lingering linguistic marker, though, caused me the most panic when I slipped as I was trying to learn how to fit in. Long after I attached my G's to my gerunds and bleached out some of the local color from my language, I stumbled over the word O-N. My mom told me to put my coat on, and those words rhymed. She told me to call her when I was on the road, and those words rhymed. To my Appalachian tongue, O-W-N and O-N were pronounced exactly the same way, but not for the rest of the world, I learned. This reminder that I was not from around here meant to me that I might not belong in a Boston graduate school. Fast forward, I'm at an ASA conference, and Silas House is the speaker. And he's talking about, he's calling us to action. And he says, in one moment, his voice cracked as he was overcome with emotion, remembering the violence enacted upon queer youth in Appalachia. Throats tightened around the room. He paused and then said quietly, and it will go on and on and on until we, the teachers and writers and students in this room, commit to change. Now, to an outsider, it might have sounded like he was saying O-W-N over and over. But when I heard Silas House repeat this word in this context, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because while he talked about justice, I heard the timbre of my paw. As he wrote his own poetry, I heard the cadence of my Aunt Betsy. As he addressed his audience, I heard my mom talking. I heard established scholars speak in accents, and it did not change the content of what they were saying. It did not change the power of their intellect. Then I stood up to deliver my paper about the politics of representation in Appalachian film. My G's were intact, my vowels stood up straight, and my own was not my own. And I felt a powerful loss of my own voice, my own accent. I can't change the fact that my granny's great-granny was raised as a white girl after her own biological parents had to leave her on the Trail of Tears. Passing for white, she had no choice but to assimilate to her surroundings to fit in. I'm unable to trace my way back to that culture, that was taken from her and connect to a past that was not allowed to happen. But I can claim the past that I have known. Now that I've learned to articulate issues about representation and gender politics, I want to do so in my own voice, to let my vows relax into the shape that they wanted to take all along. I want to honor the voices that were the soundtrack to my upbringing and respond to the calls of Uncle Joe, Granny, Aunt Lena, Aunt Betsy, Pa, and Mom. I want to draw thick that perforated line to my past. I want to claim the voices belonging to my people. Thank you.
Y'all, this doesn't sound like an Appalachian reckoning, okay? Let's give them a round of applause, all right? I'm really happy to be here and happy to be a part of this book. I came into the book through Teresa Burris. And she asked me if I would contribute a poem and explain what the book was about. And I thought, well, I haven't read the book. And I was kind of hem-hawing about, writing the poem because I needed to read the book. And I had, hi, Glenn. And I had this, I didn't want to spend the money to buy the book. So it'll come out in the poem a little bit. So being a resourceful Appalachian that I am, I know Melissa is here in the audience. Melissa's going to be graduating from law school. She's like, what's going on? Well, I was a part of a big water case. Melissa's going to graduate from this law school here come May, and she worked on the water crisis case, which I was a part of. It was good versus everybody. I don't know. I sued everybody. But and we won. Thank you, Melissa. But I had this bright idea that, I should just get, or I should ask politely, opposing counsel to buy Hillbilly Elegy because they like the book. It's a good book. They support it. And that's what happened, and I'm thankful for the donation. So I didn't actually contribute to the net worth of Hillbilly Elegy, but I did, to tell you the truth, I read the book, but I didn't read the book. I read it until I didn't want to read it anymore, and then I skimmed the rest of it. I did like the Mama part. So I'm going to read my poem here called He Said, She Said. He doesn't speak for me. He doesn't know me. He is Scots-Irish. He is not Appalachian. Mama said he can't even spell it. He likes to talk about himself, too much about himself. Mama said that's normal in the Rust Belt. We are not sure where he is from. He is a memoir. He is a bestseller. He went to Yale Law, y'all. He is fight or flight first class. He takes out white trash and Black Lives Matter bags. He is not redneck. Mama is a redneck. Mama always has her red bandana on. He didn't vote for the welfare of Miss Appalachia. He has class mobility. He parks his car at the White House. He doesn't have bumper stickers. Mama said that's a lie. He has one, Trump. He doesn't drive a Subaru. He has a vanity plate, Make America Great Again. He is punctual, right, and on the times. He goes to the movies with Opie. He was a gift. Mama said I better get to the library if I want to read that crap. She won't let he come in her house. He was already checked out. He came in the mail. My rich uncle sent. He is a lawyer. He loves Mama. I love my Mama too. She is mountain wise. She tricked me to read Hillbilly Elegy. Thank you.
We drove up here in a Subaru with a vanity plate. So I'm a photographer, and it's a thrill to be part of so much wonderful writing from and about the region. And so I got to be part of this wonderful project through the avenue of photographs, and so I helped coordinate some of the photographic contributions to this book. And what I'd like to start with is the extended caption that goes with the photograph of my Aunt Rita that's included in the book, which I think is actually coming up now. Every Saturday, without fail, Aunt Rita cleans the Chatteroy Church of God at the mouth of Chatteroy Holler. I went along with her that Saturday and afterward asked if I could stop and make some portraits of her. She asked if I thought she should change clothes or fix her hair first. I said no, that she was perfect just the way she was. As she walked out along the edge of the valley fill and looked down at the hollers below, something in me knew that this place was in her DNA too, that she was of and from and because of this place. And she was beautiful. She's never relied on anyone for anything, and she's never met a stranger and would welcome anyone who darkened her door. Standing there, she showed me what home looked like, right down to the holler and creek. I read no elegy there, only an inscription of love and home. And so I'm from Mingo County. I live in Charleston now, and I lived in North Carolina for a long time. And while I was living away in 2014 was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of the War on Poverty. And I wanted to do a Appalachian-centric project that would sort of bookend that 50th anniversary. And so I created the crowdsourced project called Looking at Appalachia. It's lookingatAppalachia.org, where it was just sort of an open invitation for folks. You didn't have to live here. You didn't even have to be from here to make photographs in the region and submit them to be considered for inclusion in the project. And right away, I kind of got in over my head. Folks really seemed to be interested in it, almost as if they were waiting for a project like that to come about. And I reached out to a handful of close friends who were photographers of different genres, some photojournalists, some fine artists and documentarians, and asked them to serve as an editorial team to help me sort of sift through these photographs so that I wasn't just another lone white guy creating the visual representation of an entire region. And so that project is now, I guess, moving into its 5th year. It's still an ongoing project. It happens on a calendar year basis, so submissions are open from January 1st through December 31st of each year. And we'd love for you to look at the project and please submit some work for consideration. Thanks.
All right, it's time for my hardball questions. And actually, it was really nice that we ended on Roger's piece, because as I was reading the caption to his photograph in the collection, that last phrase that you have in there about, I don't read any elegies, I see love, sponsored my first question. So J.D. Vance took on a very pointed perspective about the region when he named his book Hillbilly Elegy. While many people have positioned the region as backwards, stopped in time, he was announcing its death. But the chorus of voices in this book, which I've had the benefit of reading, it is so good. But it's about life in the region. And I think about the past 2 years and the West Virginia teacher strike, 55 strong, y'all. That there's an incredible vibrancy here, not just in West Virginia, but throughout the region. Yay, 50th anniversary of Apple Shop, right? Like, people are working hard and have been working hard for centuries in this place. So that's my loaded part to say, what is your perspective on the word elegy in relation to this region, and where do you see life? And Roger, would you get us kicked off with that?
Sure. Maybe I should drink the rest of this first.
Yeah, toss it back.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Apple Shop. You know, they're celebrating their 50th anniversary, and one of the great minds of that place once said, everybody wants to be a hillbilly, but nobody wants to drink the water. And that's takes a while to maybe unpack that. I mean, you could maybe teach a whole class on that. But I think there is a lot of life here, and if people, not just from away from here, people that are here too, can maybe stop and see that instead of either sucking the life out of the place or acting like that's the only thing that ever happens here. There's a lot of life here. There's a lot of vibrancy here. There's this room is full of life and people doing amazing things. And I mean, I know a handful of y'all here, and I could talk at length about some of the magnificent things that are happening here. But I think it's low-hanging fruit to paint the whole region as one that would somehow need an elegy written about it. And, you know, I did buy Hillbilly Elegy. I could have just loaned you my copy, I guess. And I read it, and, you know, at first I didn't take much issue with it. In fact, I identified with parts of it, the violence and having to move away and that sort of thing. But it didn't leave me feeling hopeless. You know, I thought, you know, the emergency exit for him was that it was labeled a memoir, you know, but it doesn't represent all of the region, much like this doesn't, or my work, or any of our independent work. But it all weaves itself together into a very alive fabric.
Thanks, Rod. So when I was outside, there was, you know, students in the hallway, and this couple walked up to the sign, and the fellow was like, "Well, what's this, Appalachian Reckoning? What's going on in here?" And his friend was they may be in here. I don't know if they're in here. They yeah, sure. They the couple, she was trying to explain to him what was going on. Clearly, he was not from here, and she knew a little bit about the, you know, the book Hillbilly Elegy, and he was saying, "Okay, well, what's an elegy?" And she's like, "Well, it's kind of like," she's trying to give a definition to elegy. She's like, "Hold on, let me Google it," right? So she Googles it, and then she gives him the proper definition. They have a little more talk about the book. I don't know if they decided to come in here. They probably won't raise their hand. But anyway, it was such a beautiful moment, because the book was doing exactly what I think everybody wants the book to do: open up the conversation. And you really can't have one without the other, meaning, you know, it's unfortunate sometimes that it takes something to make us appreciate what we have. I don't know if this book, if we would be celebrating life or waving a flag to say, "We're here, it's beautiful, it's not like that," or "That's not my story," if we didn't have a cause. I mean, you know, in many respects, you know, hey, thanks, J.D. Vance, because, you know, I'm booking speaking gigs, you know? Not, you know, not to the Opie level, but you know, I think that word, you know, it really does take the fear of death to make you appreciate life and what you have, and to raise it up. And we do in the region have a challenge in how we frame that, because we're always saying coal is dying, we're dying. I mean, we create some of that rhetoric, and we need to balance that with what I think is really the truth of the life and the energy and the beauty that is here, and the innovation, and we're in the era of transformation. I truly believe that, and yeah, and I pass. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that I kind of did the same thing the people outside did when Tony and I were trying to figure out what to call this book. I was like, well, what's the opposite of an elegy? And so I looked up elegy and read the definition to make sure I understood it, and was like, okay, yeah, no, that's definitely a poem about somebody dead. And so then it was like, well, what are other types of poems that are written that would befit what we're trying to do here? And we couldn't come up with anything. And I think we can't come up with anything because there's something finite and simple about an elegy because it's about something that's closed. And I don't know what you call a poem that is as messy and complex as the reflection that we're trying to provide, or even just like frame about Appalachia, or like how you would even describe a poem about Appalachia right now. It's not an elegy to me, but I don't have a clear word. I don't know what that genre of poem is, but I don't think it exists because it's not quite so simple.
I'll just say about the title that we did wrestle with a lot of 19th century terms for poems of different kinds, paean and all these things. We're like, no one's going to know what that is, because we didn't really know what it was. But Appalachian Reckoning we liked very much and fought for because we liked the idea of a reckoning and also reckoning about it. And so we wanted to have both of those elements there, that it was a response to J.D. Vance and some of it quite critical, but also that it was sort of a general discussion, conversation about what it is to be Appalachian, both in the region, outside the region, and we wanted to have that sort of messiness as part of it. And so certainly an open-ended, and we kind of came on this cover picture as well by accident, but I love the kind of opening into the woods, a sort of pathway forwards, rather than an empty road with an old barn and nobody around, which is, another element, I think, of Hillbilly Elegy, which is what that cover immediately speaks to. And we wanted to do the opposite of that.
All right, my next question is that one of the consistent areas of pushback that I hear people have in the critique of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, is that, and I hear a little bit of it actually echoed in Kelly Haywood's piece in it and in Alan Johnson's piece. Kelly Haywood's piece is in defense of J.D. Vance, and Alan Johnson's is, "It is crazy around here, I don't know what to do about it, and I'm just a kid." Both are great. You'll get to read it soon. So they both take up this echo of, it's a memoir, he's writing from his own experience, you really don't have a place to critique it. And so I'm curious as to how you understand the critiques of his piece, both in this book and sort of broadly, and how you position yourself around those things.
You want to go, Chris?
Oh, well, I mean, I think I love the conversation. I mean, I do. I love the conversation. I love the conversation in Appalachia. I love that it opens up doors across the country. I leave notes. This is, if I'm in an Airbnb and I see Hillbilly Elegy in there, I've been known to leave a note. This is propaganda. We don't believe in it. But it does. It opens up the conversation, and then it's always, well, it was a memoir, or when people read it from outside the region, that's their first. And I think that's where we kind of hold court in this reckoning that that it doesn't represent everybody. And so what it does is it makes an impression of what Appalachia is and how how the region is defined. So, but I think that's what's happening around the book, and the conversations is something that is necessary.
Yeah, I was just trying to find, there's a great piece in here from Dwight Billings called Once Upon a Time in Trumpalachia. And I think he says most clearly what he gave voice to this feeling that I had. When I did read the book, and like Roger, I didn't, well, maybe not entirely like Roger, I didn't like it. But I thought, okay, I didn't think it was super well written, but that's fine. Not all books are, and it's his story. What bothered me, though, was the slippery line between I and we, and the way that he's not just telling his story, and that it's, the subtitle of the book is a memoir of a family and a culture in crisis. And Dwight Billings points out that you can't write a memoir about a culture. That's not a thing. And that, to me, was where he crossed the line. But probably if he had just written this book and that was it would be one thing. But it was the fact that he stepped boldly into the position of spokesperson for Appalachia as kind of without trying to complicate it, that was the problem that I had with that part of it.
Yeah, I would just say that the use of hillbilly is very unproblematic in that book as well. He uses about 60
What do you
times.
know about that word?
Yeah, he never really thinks about what it might mean or different audiences for it. And he uses, he's kind of aggressively anti-scholarly. I mean, he has about 3 sources, I think, that he draws on. For a whole region that has, hundreds of books written about it and deep understandings of its history and its complexity. So that was, as a historian, kind of offensive to me. But I don't question his life story. I think it's very poignant, very true to him. I don't question that he's an Appalachian because of his connections with his grandmother. I don't have problems with that at all. But I don't think he can speak for the whole region, and I don't think to say that this is a memoir of a culture, really allows for any kind of complexity. And it just reinforces what so many people already assume and expect and think. And so rather than using it as a space to complicate understanding, I think he used it as a space to reinforce understanding. And part of his enormous appeal, I think, was that it worked for the left and the right. There's deeply progressive writers who were all about it, and then there were obviously very conservative people too. And so I think that probably shows you some degree of what he was leaving out and what we were trying to put back in.
As a photographer, I kind of saw Hillbilly Elegy as kind of like this neatly packaged anecdotal memoir that if people read it, they could say, oh, I get it, I understand the region. Not unlike the War on Poverty photographs, in the 60s that, America and the world, in fact, were sort of inundated with. And they saw these photographs of these dirty, barefoot kids. I mean, anybody ever played dirty and barefoot as a kid that was maybe not in poverty? I mean, so in many ways, I feel like, this was just sort of an offering to appease a lot of people who just wanted to know just enough about it to say, oh, those poor people, without any of the complexities like some of these folks have talked about. So.
All right, I'm not going to hog up all of the question time, so I'll share the floor, even though I have more questions. So if you have a question, we have a microphone up in the center. You're welcome to come on up and pose one to a particular individual on the panel or to the group as a whole.
Nobody's made any reference to Elizabeth Catt's book, What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia. I just wondered what your comments were about that book.
Well, I get to show my picture now. I love the book, and Elizabeth's book is genius. And my sort of, if I was going to do an anthology or the complement, the film version, it would be this. This is my version of 9 to 5, and there's me, and there's Elizabeth Catt, and there's JD. So her work is incredible, and I buy that book so frequently for so many people, especially as when they should just be sold. Now it needs to be on triplet. When Amazon, it needs to be Elizabeth's book, Appalachian Reckoning, and Hillbilly Elegy. They all need to go together.
And she does have a piece in this book where she's writing about the use of Hillbilly Elegy. It's called Hillbilly Elegy on the syllabus, but she's talking about the ways that so many colleges picked Hillbilly Elegy as the common reading and what's going on when that is the choice. So
It was almost selected here, but we escaped.
Really?
Come on up to the microphone, please.
Let me just
Oh.
stand right here. I'll be loud enough.
Okay.
Is that?
Let me bring you
Yeah.
the microphone. Just in case we're back here.
Thank you. I'm an 84-year-old West Virginian from Wheeling, went to school here. I read the book Crumb, and that started me on being outraged about our state. Then Vance came along, and I thought it was just entertaining, but he had no right to speak for West Virginia. He could speak about his experience. And then Elizabeth's book came along, and that helped. I can't wait to read what you all have written, because I need to put in perspective a person who's lived out of state until we just moved back to Morgantown last fall, to get an understanding. But one more point, though. How do we move forward to get rid of the Trump perspective of us rednecks? How do we make our state be a more positive influence in this country? Does your book begin to outline that? Do your poems give us a sense of feeling? Because we're so proud of this state, that we who are part of this town, this community, this state. How do we move forward in literature, in poetry? How can we do that? What will you all do? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think that I want to be clear that this book is not the book that will help anyone understand West Virginia or any part of Appalachia. It is a collection of multiple, really varied, different experiences, and that, to Tony and me, was really the first step in doing what you're talking about. I won't try to give an answer to how we do that, but this is my feeling was that collecting a bunch of voices simply by, I keep using this idea of passing the mic, which is great because that just happened, but that all we really have to do is pass the mic around, or get people to send pictures in, because we don't have to create anything. We don't really need to create an agenda in terms of this book. All that we needed to do was to say, hey, tell your perspectives about Appalachia. And I think that is certainly not all that needs to be done, but that is a huge part of changing the perspective by allowing people from this really rich, diverse place to tell their own stories and allow them to be really different and sometimes even contradictory. So that's what I think this book is trying to do, but this book certainly doesn't, it's not the book on Appalachia. Anybody have perspectives on how to fix the problem he's talking about?
Well, I would say your state teachers are doing a good job of remaking. I really do think that it's been a hugely influential thing and spreading across the country as well. And it also gets to the idea that the way you change things is through collective effort and not through a single individual having all the answers, whether they're an author or a president. So that's what I would say. And I think our book is trying to do that as well, to have multiple voices, giving multiple perspectives. And I made a little map of all our contributors, really bad map on Google, best I could do. But it's really quite amazing how widespread it goes. A lot of people are out of state now or out of the region, but nonetheless, it goes from New York to Georgia, California to Virginia. And so it's, there's a lot of voices of Appalachia, not just in Appalachia. And I think, we're trying to give a forum for that.
What do the West Virginians have to say?
Well, I don't really know of a way forward until we start learning about our past. And I'm not a historian, but I consider it my personal responsibility to know my history of where I'm from and what we as a state and as a people have been put through especially in 2019 when you've got coal industry lobbyists asking the legislature for a decrease in coal severance tax. You know, I don't want to get on a political rant about coal, but it's an important part, if not a central part, to this state. And so until we start to understand our history and know all the card tricks that have already been played on us, we're not going to find a way forward. Once we know that, and once we have a firm foundation under our feet on who we are and the rich history, the rich labor history, the rich musical history, the cultural, the artistic history of this state, and we actually start teaching that history in schools in this state, I don't really know. My mom's 63 years old, and she had never heard of the Battle of Blair Mountain until I talked to her about it, because it wasn't taught in schools. Probably still not taught in schools. I don't know. But that's why it's important for, you know, the writers and the artists and the artisans that are in this room, the lawyers, the CPAs, the bus drivers, or whatever, regardless of your lot in life, it is your responsibility to know your history and help figure out a way forward. But for $28.99, you can pick this up.
Oh, gosh. So, I mean, to echo what Roger said, you know, when I found the word Appalachian and I found Frank X. Walker and the Appalachian poets in Kentucky, I really found myself and I found a community. And it's beautiful to see so many writers in here that I know. People often ask me, who's your favorite poet? Who's your favorite writer? And they're people I know. They're people whose work I've watched become, and that's special to me. It really is. It really is family to me. And so, when I think about the future of West Virginia, it is, of course, knowing your past and finding a word like Appalachia, like reckoning, that can carry you on. Because I think we, as much as we have to know our past, we have to see our future, and we have to see that as diverse, as a diverse conversation, and through the arts. And what we don't necessarily know, change is coming. So what, and by that I mean, you know, we require a newness in order to sustain ourselves. And I think that we keep having the same conversations about energy and not enough conversations about technology, and not enough conversations, if we're going to get political for a minute, you know, things that sort of challenge the status quo. I don't know, Airbnb, Uber, you know, things that, you know, amenities that the rest of the world has. And so I think that as much as we look past, we have to start dreaming of our future, and that's really important to me. It's sort of that unknown variable, which is very uncomfortable for people that like the familiarity.
I wanted to ask you, doesn't every state have its Appalachia?
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
There are pockets of, you know, hillbillies everywhere.
Yeah.
But it seems we're focused on. But actually, if you've traveled this country, everybody has their Appalachia.
I'm trying to remember now who I read, but it was somebody in the last week that was talking, that would have a really good answer to your question, so I'll try to answer that. Basically, the idea is that there are people in Iowa who are to other Iowans the other, right? So they're poor, maybe they're barefoot in the mud. But if you say that you're from Iowa, and if you go to California and say you're from Iowa, people don't assume that that means that you're barefoot in the mud. And I think that the idea of the hillbilly, well, you should be talking about the idea of hillbilly.
Well, you go ahead.
Well, just that the idea of associating hillbilly with, it's this intersection of place and class that that simplifies what it means to be a hillbilly and is sort of like this rippling, damning effect on the rest of the region based on the representation of a few. And I don't think that happens to the poor in different parts of the state. So I do think it's a little bit different, but you should speak to this a little bit as a scholar of hillbillies.
Well, I think it has something to do with race as well, because I think there's assumptions that people of color are going to be poor, and that's sort of okay, that's sort of acceptable, understandable, both because of American racism and because of ongoing American racism about limitations of possibilities. But to be poor and white, there must be something wrong with you, and I think that's part of it. I think also Appalachia serves the purpose of being the place of poverty, and therefore you don't have to think about poverty in your midst. And so in Iowa or wherever, those people are, the exception to the rule that don't really have to be worried about too much because they're the exception. And because there is Appalachia, or because the way Appalachia gets framed, it gets seen as a space of these problems that are sort of almost kind of take the place of worrying about it elsewhere. And also because it gets framed as not so much as a serious crisis, but as a kind of joke. And I think that's the other element here. I taught at Princeton University, and I went there for an interview, and my interviewer asked me a joke. She said, what has 30 teeth and 7 pairs or 20 pairs of shoes? And, la ha ha. And I said, I don't know. And she said, the front 2 rows of the Grand Ole Opry. And I was like, can you imagine her making such a joke about African Americans or Italians or any other group, It's a way in which it gets framed as kind of unproblematic, and therefore both kind of, it's their own fault, that's part of it, and also that it's the only place which is really a problem. And so you don't have to think about systemic poverty across the society.
Thank you for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I was lucky enough to be at a screening of Hillbilly that was screened on Friday in town. So, of course, I know Crystal Good was involved with this project, and others in their scholarship in there. My question is sort of forward-looking. We now have these beautiful pieces of film, photographs, literature, poetry. How do we get this out there? How do we get people looking at this instead of what's going to become a Ron Howard movie? I mean, and again, not to demonize J.D. Vance, but the oversimplification and the notoriety of the stupid stereotype continues to go forward, and I love what's being done to change that. Do you guys have ideas of how to popularize this as opposed to the other nonsense that goes out there?
I thought Ron Howard would be here tonight, because this would make a really good movie.
But there is a representative from Netflix in the back that we would like to talk to about a movie. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I think the hard truth is that we didn't arrive at this point overnight, and there's no real easy way out of it except to just kind of everybody doing their part. It's like a civic responsibility, right? I mean, we have to educate ourselves about who to vote for in local elections, and that sort of thing, and so then hopefully over time that just sort of outpaces or outgrows all the negativity, because in this age of information and technology and the free flowing of data, this is like a prime time to really be doing that kind of work. So I think it's a matter of time, but probably not anytime soon.
But I am optimistic that, I live in Maine now, and a lot of people said to me, oh, I read Hillbilly Elegy, and so that's where you're from, that sort of idea. And I am really happy now to be able to give them Elizabeth Catt's book and say, this is what he's getting wrong about Appalachia and what you might also be getting wrong about Appalachia. And I hope that this will become a book like that. And I think Hillbilly, what Sally Rubin and Ashley York have done there, and that documentary, if you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. Can you see it other places too? Yes, you can see it other places. So, but that documentary is, I get that a documentary about representations of Appalachia is not going to get the same, viewership as this Ron Howard film, but it's nice that it's out there. It's still something, right? It's better than nothing, and I think that we have to keep fighting, and that fighting may be incremental, but it matters. It counts.
Elegy talked about the drinking and the beating and the negatives. What do you see about the Appalachian culture that should be preserved and maybe shared with others?
Want to speak to that, Roger?
Well, we're people, we're people from a region with families, we have unique things to our culture. You said preserved and talking about canning and, I think what I would like to see, just to kind of like roll some questions up in one, is we get very defensive, and I think that the defensive posture is necessary, and it's been necessary for a long time to kind of defend who we are. I took offense when it's just how it goes, when it's, it doesn't everybody have an Appalachia. Well, Appalachia is a region, and that to me felt like a negative, like, well, what do you mean? Doesn't everybody have an Appalachia? And I feel like I'm constantly, even through poetry, I wish I could write, love poems instead of environmental disaster poems, but those are love poems too. I think that, sometimes, you just want the region, and you get tired of being in a defense. I don't know if I'm answering your questions per se specifically, but it just feels like we're just a part of America too. We have our unique qualities and accents and foods and stories, and we just want to, I just want that to be celebrated in the context of, to take a Langston Hughes, ain't we America too,
I think also, I love language and dialect, and I think one of the things that we've shamed ourselves, and we've allowed ourselves to be shamed by other people because we don't talk right, we don't talk correctly, and I would love it rather than a teacher or a parent or Sunday school teacher correcting a kid on saying white instead of white. To just pull them aside and say, that's beautiful. You keep saying it that way. I moved to North Carolina when I was 15, and we were standing outside the gym one day, and it was me and a couple of guys and a couple of girls, and they were like, hey, Raj, what color is that wall over there? White? And they'd laugh. And I was like, oh, I don't want to stand out any more than I already do because I'm new and I don't know these people. And so pretty soon it became white. And then I would go home and visit family, and I'd say, what kind of soda do y'all have? Soda. We got pop here. What do you know? And then it felt like I didn't even fit in at home. And so to live in this space in between of all based on dialect, because it sounded funny, and nobody ever told me the way I talked was beautiful before I assimilated. And if I could do anything, I would go back and pull that 15-year-old kid aside and say, don't, that wall is white.
So I haven't read your book, but to answer the question that this gentleman put up, the one thing that I think Appalachia can export, and it's one of the things I love about Appalachian culture. I've lived in Kaiser for the last 40 years, and it's just a small 7,000 person town. There's a double-edged sword here, but the people have adapted to living without money, a lot of money. They have some money, and they're happy with that. They're content with, making $24,000 a year, and they have perfectly happy lives. They're not worried about new cars. They're not showing off. People don't do a lot of conspicuous consumption. If somebody, like the doctors in town, if they have a fancy house, it's buried out in the country. That conspicuous consumption is just not out in your face, and it just doesn't mean that much to people. And so it's a double-edged sword. If you put your energy into your family and just enjoying your current life and going to church and just being a decent person, well, then you're not worried about ripping somebody off and conning them into getting a whole lot of money and doing all this extra workaholism to have the big fancy car to put out in front of everybody and be a big shot. So that's one of the things I love about Appalachia.
I agree, but I gotta say, it's a lot easier to spend time with your family if you make a living wage. And I think it's hard to, just quickly, one thing about Appalachia that has always worked in this, you're saying double-edged sword, and I'll agree, there's this duality the way that people have talked about Appalachia. And they've both romanticized, oh, it's so great that they're fighting against capitalism and they're not the conspicuous consumption that you're talking about. There's something that is really in this time, there's something to be admired about making do or choosing to resist capitalism. But I think that choosing to resist capitalism is really different than not being able to afford to take care of your family well. And so that idea of romanticizing, kind of poverty or maybe the choice to do without, but I think it's often making do because you don't really have a choice. And that romanticizing of that lifestyle has been a way that the other side of that is that it's a justification for the erasure of people who don't fit into what we assume about the rest of America.
Yeah, and the other double-edged sword.
And if I may, also, the reason why teachers have been striking is because they can't afford to live. Teachers in Kaiser are working 3 jobs because they can't afford to live on their salary. So it's not that they're happy, they're actually fighting desperately to be paid more so that they don't only have to work 1 job that they might love.
Well, and the other part is if you're not worried about money, then you allow people to rip you off. So you allow, like the coal companies to come in, export all our coal, and we don't get anything.
I just don't know anybody who's not worried about money except people who have plenty of it.
Right.
Personally.
Anyway, I'll let that, I'm not gonna sit here and barter with that, but I see people in where I live, it's just they're actually okay. Like I'm working with a guy and he doesn't make a whole lot of money right now. We're working on my house. And he's just a very pleasant guy and he's not unhappy at all. He doesn't make a lot of money.
Kindness is a wonderful feature of many, many people, and it's a wonderful thing, so thank you. Are there other questions?
I'd like to just make a statement, if I may. I'm from California, and I'm here to do hemp business. I don't know anything about the Appalachian community at all. That's why I'm here. So a book brought me here so I can understand the culture. I'm from poverty, but I'm an opportunist. And I've met lots of West Virginians, as I may say, if that's right or wrong, and Appalachians, that one of the first things is they're very stand-up.
generations and generations. And that traditional generation, I want to learn about, because I played with no shoes on, and I do drive a fancy car, but I came here as a humbled farmer, so I can understand that mentality of the working class. Because at times that I've been having opportunities, I wasn't given a break, or I didn't meet the right person, or I wasn't at the right place. So I've came here to create economics, not to buy your land, but to take you as a person and turn you into an economic feature. Take that commodity, put it in a marketplace to give families opportunities. So I'm a hemp farmer, and I'm an agricultural person. So what I came here to do is learn about the agricultural, the people that have built this community in West Virginia. And I tell you what, looking from the outside in, there's a lot of opportunity. You got to let it in. And I just went on Facebook. I don't know anything about what's going on with this book. I don't know one thing, but what I did come here to do is to learn about the Appalachian. So I want to tell you, thank you for your comments. Thank you for putting this together. Because when I leave here, I understand, because where I come from, we're doing the same thing, just in a different part of the world. And the Appalachian does have an identity, and the identity is amazing, but how do we get that identity out? And that's what I'm after when I come here, 12-hour flight, and I sit in a room. I want to learn about you, you that have created this beautiful community, these beautiful pictures, poetry, putting this spotlight into play, because actually there's so much opportunity in West Virginia. It's mind-boggling when I sit here and I get to learn more about the Appalachian people. So thank you for hosting this and making it an opportunity for a guy like me to learn about things I have no clue about. I'm 48 years old. I learn something new every day. I'm living, I'm loving, and I'm enjoying life with the Appalachians. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thanks. Since you like to learn something every day, I'll tell you it's pronounced Appalachian. So, my question is, it's about process for this book, because I think when we grow up in West Virginia or Appalachia, we're sort of thrust into this kind of defensive position from the get-go. And I think that we spend a lot more time talking about what we aren't rather than what we are. Just that's sort of the nature of the conversation. And I think that when Hillbilly Elegy came out, I saw that challenge sort of reinforced, and I've seen a lot of really well-intentioned conversations and works come out that were meant to be responses to J.D. Vance, but I felt like they ended up talking a lot more about J.D. Vance than the sort of proactive message that we wanted to get out about the region. So particularly for the editors, what's your process been like in trying to figure that out and making sure that the sort of proactive message doesn't get lost in this conversation about J.D. Vance?
I'll say that, as I mentioned when I read my piece, that my original idea had nothing to do with J.D. Vance. It was maybe, no, I think it even preceded the book, but I had been thinking about how to tell more stories from, not me tell the stories, but how to gather stories from Appalachia. And then when it became framed as like this need to maybe, respond to J.D. Vance, my inclination was not to turn away from him or to ignore him completely, but I had this image of creating a chorus so that he could be one voice, but there was a chorus of other voices. And that to me was a really important thing, because I agree with you. I think a lot of the good writing that came after Hillbilly Elegy, sometimes it was a little bit too focused on Vance, and I wanted to just broaden the focus.
Yeah, I think we saw it as an opportunity to have a bigger conversation and use it as a launching point. And, frankly, it continues to be so, like Crystal said. There's interest in him and there's interest in reaction to him. And so if we can use that to have more voices heard, there's a poem in here called Social Capital by Jeff Mann, and he says, what other Appalachian voices have been drowned out in the flood of attention that Vance and his book have garnered? And we're trying to have more of those voices. And And also, I think I was very much interested in having voices that saw positive things in J.D. Vance as well. I didn't want it to be a book of simply criticism of him, and that was harder to come by. But I think we did find some, we have a range of responses, and then a lot of people who are simply re-looking at their own lives and their own experiences through the prism of the tsunami that has been Hillbilly Elegy, which kind of engulfed everything. And I think in the aftermath of that, we can see multiple ways to approach it. So I think that's how we approach the book.
And I can't remember if this was Roger's term or not, but when I talked to Roger about this, he was resistant to jumping on board and collecting these photographs to throw in until he really understood what the project was about. And I don't remember if it was Roger that said it, could have been Tony, but one of the things that's driven me is this idea that I don't want to be a part of a mean-spirited project. To me, we can be critical and we can put facts down and we can complicate the ways that people see this place, but I don't really feel like we have to be mean-spirited to do that.
I don't want to silence anyone, so continue. All right. Are there any other remaining questions? One last? All right.
Hi there. I feel like one of the reasons that J.D. Vance's book was so popular had something to do with the election, right? And people wanted to understand why Appalachia voted so heavily for someone like Trump. Do you think that a book that finally shows sort of the diversity of Appalachia also complicates maybe some of the understandings that people may have of why this area may have voted for Trump?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it wasn't the only area that voted for Trump. It gets framed that way sometimes, and Dwight Billings' point about Trumpalachia is it's kind of seen as the entire Appalachian region as sort of one voting block, that votes in sequence, and I think we're all trying to figure out how that happened, and this was an easy solution, I guess, to many people, that this was the explanation. And it is part of the explanation, but I think it's important to recognize the complexity of the political landscape as much as the cultural landscape and the historical landscape, and we're going to keep trying to figure out that answer, hopefully.
And is the first piece on Trumpalandia is a good response to that?
Trumpalachia, yeah.
Yeah. Trumpalachia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are, just to be clear, there's scholarship and narrative in here. So we've maybe talked more about the collective stories, but there's also direct response. And so the piece that we were just talking about, Dwight Billings talks about Once Upon a Time in Trumpalachia, and he's speaking very directly to that phenomenon that you were talking about.
All right, final question.
Sounds good. Hopefully I can do it justice. I know that I didn't really know how much I loved Appalachia until I left, and it kind of sank in more and more. I was wondering if you guys have a perspective on whether or not there would be any utility in pushing this pro-Appalachian message back towards young Appalachians before they feel the push to get out and then never come back. Is there a concerted effort that you guys have seen? And if not, can you guys do something? Because this is awesome. This is awesome, and I wish I would have heard about this book when I was 15.
Well, I think part of, for me at least, part of the process of loving home so much was leaving it. I didn't have a choice in the leaving, but I did in the returning, and I think there's something, for me at least, crucial that happened. Moving at first 300 miles away, and then 3,000 and 6,000 miles away when I was in the military, and then coming back. And one of my favorite pieces of writing by Jim Wayne Miller is this piece called the Brier Sermon. and he talks about there being a road back. And it's sort of this admonishment to not run off and leave the best part of yourself behind, and not necessarily just chase capitalism and that sort of thing, and that everything that we've ever needed is what he says is in our Father's house. We've got to come back to our Father's house, sort of reorient ourselves so that we know when we step out our front door, we know where we are, we know who we are. And I don't know if my love for West Virginia would be the same had I not done that.
So when I left home as a teenager and got kind of fancy, and I told my granddaddy I wasn't coming back. We didn't even have a Target. And he said, well, why don't you just drive up the road there a little bit when you get a chance? I said, all right, Granddaddy. So I drove up the road, and sure enough, there was a sign that said, coming soon, Target. And then he said, you might want to learn a little bit about where you're from before you get all, fancy in your pants there. And my granddaddy always knew how to push my buttons, and so I kind of really went on, learning so much about West Virginia. He loved West Virginia. His name was Diz Titcher, and he moved away to Florida, and he was about 6'4", and everybody knew Diz from West Virginia. And so I really just want to thank him for challenging me and knowing his granddaughter well enough to to push my buttons to learn about home, and it's changed my life. I think that to have a grounding here, to know who and what I'm from, and the thing about our children, I think no other place tries to hold on to their children like we do. Other places, I think, have this idea that, oh, go. It's okay, go. Go to New York City. They kind of expect their children to leave, but because we're, we feel this sort of like dependency, we want everybody to stay, so I think we need to reframe that it's okay to leave, and then potentially, you'll come back. I think just, that we kind of put this fear, and then and that you really haven't made it unless you've left, right? Like, I'm a poet in West Virginia, so that means I'm a poet in West Virginia. I don't know, but I just wrote a piece, 100 Days of Appalachia, published it, and I'm talking about my child leaving, and here in Trumpalachia, people would assume that because I have a black transgender child, that her challenges would come from, the so-called stereotype of a Trumpalachian. My child left because in the LGBT community, there is still white supremacy. And that's the piece that I wrote about. So Appalachia, West Virginia, is nuanced. We're not one thing. We don't fit in a particular box, and I think that that's uncomfortable for people. But as far as the future generation goes, I think we just have to empower our children. And I'm so glad that I wrote that piece, because my baby girl said, I didn't know how much I was loved. I didn't know how much love was there for me, how much acceptance was there for me. She had a small, lens, right? And because I wrote that piece, she was able to read the comments. I mean, there were some other comments, but for the most part, the outpouring was really, we're sorry, we support you, you're beautiful, all of the things that she should have heard before she left, and she got to hear them. And so with that, she said, I wish I'd heard it, but, and if I ever have to come back, or if I ever come back, and that door is open. So I think that that's what we have to do for our children. We have to let them we do have to let them go, but we have to empower them with their roots and not out of fear or defensiveness, you know, like, and I love the expats of Appalachia, because whenever there is a crisis, whenever there is something that we need, and thank God for WVU Journalism School and the people that write and tell stories across the world, people in CNN, people at the Huffington Post that have an attachment to here, that get our stories out. I think, to answer your question, that this book will get legs. It will get more legs when the movie comes out. I mean, it will get more legs as people from the region read it and share it in their classrooms, in their blogs, in their articles. I mean, we take care of each other. To speak to your question about what is Appalachian culture, or what do we need to celebrate, I mean, we take care of each other. I have a good fortune of, you know, pretty much anywhere I go, if I post it on Facebook, somebody's gonna give me a room and help me out. And I think and I can trust that, because, you know, I came through this book through Teresa Burris. I would not have been a part of this book. I didn't have to question, you know, I had some questions, but for the most part, Teresa vetted it for me. And I think that's kind of the beauty of our culture.
And
Yeah, I'm all over.
I have to quickly say that Lou Murray, who has a photograph in the book, is somehow involved with STAY, which is Stay Together Appalachian Youth Project. So there are people organizing around that, and it's actually, I hope, a good segue from what Crystal's talking about, that it's not the idea of like, we have to keep the youth here. It's looking at the different ways that you can be Appalachian youth and stay, I think, is the idea of the project.
Love Lou.
So you can buy this book and give it to your children's teacher.
Thank y'all so much.
I'll be using it in my classroom and all of my students' future classrooms. They get an A+ if they use it. All right, at this time, we need to bring our event to a close. I want to thank you all for your questions and thoughtfulness during this time. But most of all, I'd like to thank WVU Press for helping to bring this book to reality. To the WVU Humanities Center for helping to co-sponsor this event, and to the Appalachian Justice Initiative through the WVU College of Law. Thank you all so much for sponsoring this event. And a deep thanks to our editors for bringing together something that was both a response, but beyond a response. It is both personal and scholarly, literary and artistic. This is a truly rich and complex representation of a rich and complex region. And I love the chorus of voices metaphor for your book, because that really resonates with me as a reader of it. So thank you all so much for each of your contributions to this and to the work that you do beyond this book. It's really important to our place.
Thank you.
God bless you on the book tour, because it's going to be a room that just didn't expect me. That one.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely.